Perek Kuf Yud, Psalm 110, is a short mizmor. David mizmor Ne'um Adonai, Ladoni Shev, Limini, Ad Ashit Oivecha Hadom Liraglecha. Sort of a strange verse, not voice, of David, a psalm. So we have a psalm, another kapitel of Tehillim like we usually have. What does God say? So the Lord said to my Lord, which is a strange thing as well. What does it mean, God said to my Lord? Is this servant of David saying that God said this to David or something of that sort? Sit at my right hand while I make your enemies your footstool. So David, we know in Tehillim, has asked so many times for his enemies to be taken care of. And here we see that God says, if you sit at my right hand, I'm going to take care of your enemies. Matei uzcha yishlach Adonai mitzion, ridei bekerev oivecha. God will stretch forth from Zion his mighty scepter, and he will hold sway over your enemies. Just as an aside, I saw somebody who wrote, the chapter is going to get more gruesome and more gruesome. And one way of understanding it is at first God says to whomever it is that he's talking to, let's imagine for a second it's David. God says, I'm going to try to calm your enemies down. I'm going to try to get them to just, be your footstool. You're not going to have to, they're not going to suffer. They're going to transform and change. We mentioned days ago the chapter where Bruria, when Yitamu Chata'im min haaretz, when she says to her husband, who have these people in town who are bothering him, and she says to her husband, don't pray that they die, pray that their sins be removed. And he does. And of course, in the story, their sins are removed and they become righteous people. So at first, God is saying they'll just become your footstool. They're no longer going to bother you. They're just going to be regular people and everything's going to be okay. But now we move to verse 2 is already, God will stretch forth from Zion his scepter and hold sway over your enemy. And it continues, Amcha nidavot biyom chelecha, behadrei kodesh merechem, mishchar lecha tal yaldutecha. Your people will come forward on the day of battle in their holiness from the womb. From the dawn, yours was the dew of your youth, right? So from the get-go, your people are going to be there. They're going to be ready to battle. They're going to be ready to fight with you. They're going to be ready to wage God's battle against your enemies. Nishba Adonai v'lo yinachem, ata chohen le'olam, al divrati malki tzedek. God has sworn and will not relent. God will not give up. Why not? You are a priest forever. You are an eternal priest, a rightful king. By my decree, I have made you king, is what God says here. Adonai al yamincha machatz biyom apo milachim. God is at your right hand. God crushes in the day of his anger. When God is angry, God is going to crush the enemies, your enemies who have been so oppressive to you on this day and forever, right? So as I said, it's getting worse. It didn't seem so bad, but now things are getting worse for the enemy of whomever this person is, for this king, for this other lord. And we continue with verse 6, and this is a verse that we hear regularly. On Moshe Shabbatot, Yadin Bagoyim Malay Giviot Machatz Rosh Al Eretz Rabbah. God, what's he going to do? He's going to judge the nations. And there's going to be a huge pile of bodies, crushing heads far and wide. As I said, it's getting worse and worse. What's going to happen to the enemies? Minachal Baderech Yishteh. God will drink from the stream on his way. For God, for your people, everything's going to be fine. Al Kain Yarim Rosh. Therefore, he holds his head high. And of course, that psalm is part of the of Harachamim that we say on Shabbat. The of Harachamim that was composed in the aftermath of the pogroms, when so many Jews, when there were dead bodies, heaps of dead bodies that were there, and we were praying for God to take vengeance, as it says in this chapter. So we have a chapter here, and there are different ways of of understanding in a very nice way. That was from Rabbi Yaakov Bieler, who was the rabbi in Silver Spring for a long time, wrote this interpretation of how it's getting, God is trying to comfort the enemies, but over time it's going to go in a completely different way, where things are going to be filled with corpses. And oh, I just realized, I guess my recording was video was off. My apologies. So, but what happens here ultimately is the big question of this chapter is, who is this king? Who is this Lord? Who is this person that God is talking to in this chapter? So one hint, the word Melchizedek, and that's probably the main understanding in the Midrash and traditionally, that this is a chapter that was addressed to Avraham. That God is going, Abraham's life was not simple. God said to Abraham, you're going to go to the land of Israel and everything's going to be fine. But things were not that simple for Abraham. He didn't just go into the land of Israel and the next day his wife became pregnant and everybody said, this is your land. We're going to make space for you. He had famines and he had to go here and there. And there were many, many struggles. And the word Melchizedek is the king who Abraham greets, and Abraham meets Melchizedek, Melech Shalem, comes out after Abraham goes and defeats the enemies of Sodom and saves his nephew Lot, who was in captivity. And so those who say it was Melchizedek. There's another interpretation that, of course, it's the Melech HaMashiach. We think about the Messianic king who's going to have to struggle and suffer, but the Jews will be behind them from the womb. A third interpretation, one which we sort of alluded to, which makes sense in the book of Tehillim, is King David. King David, who obviously had to deal with adversaries, who had to deal with enemies, and whose life was not always simple. And so the idea that he's king forever would be a good reference for David, who God promises his dynasty and his descendants will be their kings forever. You could say that about Abram, his people, and Abram becomes Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. They become, in a sense, priests. And then there's a fourth interpretation, which is interestingly you can find in the commentary of the Radak. It is not an interpretation that the Radak agrees with, but is an interpretation that is believed by many, many people. And it's not that hard to think about it once you say it. One Lord said to the other Lord. So who is it? The Christians believe that this is a paragraph, and they see it in almost every paragraph in the Tanakh. They want to look for it, that this is about Jesus. God said to the other Lord, God said to Jesus, right? I am going to, I'm going to sit at my right hand. I will make your enemies your footstool. God will stretch out his mighty scepter. They see, images to Jesus already from the womb, right? We talk about Jesus and Immaculate Conception, and Jesus, who's understood as being a priest and being a king, and all these other aspects and all these other things. And so, not surprising, and this is a chapter that's regularly said by Christians, I think, in weekday services. The Radak actually mentions it. And if we think historically, while we don't know that the Radak was involved in any of these, there was a time period when there were many disputations and many public arguments between Christians and Jews. The most well-known one was in Barcelona between the Ramban Nachmanides and a convert, Pablo Cristiani. I was just talking about this earlier today with students in high school. Right, there was a sense there that you had to be able to prove that your religion was the superior religion, was the better one. And so the Radak and others will mention commentaries like this in order to reject them and in order to give a Jewish version of these commentaries in the way we're supposed to understand them, the way we can relate to them. By the way, I heard, I don't know if it's true, and I haven't looked it up, but if you look in the classical old edition of the Mikraot Gedolot, the common Chumash that was printed and originally to get permission to publish a Jewish book, you needed permission from the Pope, and the earliest Gemaraot and the earliest printings of the Chumash had to be approved by the Catholic Church. That the Radak, who is in many of the Mikraot Gedolot, this commentary of his was not in there. Whether that was the Jews scared for their life who decided to leave out this comment where he mentions Jesus and rejects Jesus as the person who God is referring to in this chapter, or whether it was the Christians who removed it, that I don't know. But it's interesting to note. So we have a chapter here. Seems like God, I'll take care of it. It will be okay to these enemies, they don't listen, even though I've tried to just subdue them, and therefore there's going to be some horrors, there's going to be some disaster. Who is it referring to? Well, according to Jewish tradition, there are numerous different interpretations, three that we possibly mentioned, from past to future: Avraham, David, the Melech HaMashiach. And there is, of course, another interpretation that many others in the world believe in, but it is not that for our people.